welcome to the Reimagining the Latinx Experience book talk series. We're so pleased to have with us today Professor Steve Bender, Professor Frank Valdes, and Professor Margaret Montoya. We'll be discussing this book on LatCrit, which really describes how this whole it's like a movement, and it's a program, and it's an institution all at the same time, really developed through a very collaborative process to have foundational principles and clear goals and strategies, and also implementation, which turns out to be very difficult. So you're in for a treat. Before we begin, I actually did want to acknowledge some people who make the series possible. First of all, I want to thank Dean Austin Parrish at the University of California, Irvine, a School of Law, for his support. And I also want to thank Bryant Garth at the American Bar Foundation for its ongoing support. I also want to introduce myself. I'm Rachel Moran. I'm here today to introduce our speakers, but I also want to introduce Elizabeth Schatz-Cordero, my wonderful research assistant here at Irvine Law. And she will be actually taking the questions. So we really want to hear from you. So if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A function. And then Elizabeth will monitor those questions and pose them to our panelists. To the extent that we have time, we're going to try to get to all your questions. Now, before we get started, I wanted to briefly introduce our very distinguished panel, beginning with Professor Bender, who I really should refer to as Associate Dean Bender, because he serves as Associate Dean for Planning and Strategic Initiatives, as well as being a professor of law. He is an academic leader on immigration law and policy, and he was awarded in recognition of his both research and his service and his teaching, the C. Clyde Ferguson Jr. Award from the minority group section of the Association of American Law Schools. So it's really kind of the, achievement award for all areas of excellence. I also wanted to mention that he's such a prolific scholar, and I can only highlight a few of his publications, but one of them is a book called Deadly Voyages, Migrant Journeys Across the Globe, which was published in 2020. And I also wanted to mention his How the West Was Won, Reimagining the U.S.-Mexico Border in 2017, as well as One Night in America, Robert Kennedy, Cesar Chavez, and the Dream of Dignity, published in 2008, which won the 2008 Oregon Book Award for general nonfiction. Next, I wanted to introduce Professor Valdes, who he actually began his career. He was getting his JSD, doing his dissertation at Stanford, and was asked to join the faculty at Cal Western School of Law, which is pretty unusual. You haven't finished your PhD, and they already want you on the faculty. So that's quite impressive. And then he moved to the University of Miami, where he co-founded the Law School Center for Hispanic and Caribbean Legal Studies, as well as its Spain Study Abroad summer program, and he served as co-director of each of those programs. Since 2008, he also has served as founding faculty advisor to the University of Miami's Race and Social Justice Law Review. And in 2010, he was designated a Dean's Distinguished Scholar and appointed the founding director of the University of Miami Junior Faculty Development Program, which does the all-important work of ensuring that new faculty have the support they need to thrive and survive in the legal academy. In 2002, he edited a very important collection of essays called Crossroads, Histories and Directions, a New Critical Race Theory. He's actually at work on a number of projects, which I hope he'll describe during our presentation, but he was founding co-chair of LatCrit, Inc., and he also, believe it or not, we have two Clyde Ferguson Award winners on this panel. He won the same award from the AALS Minority Group section, as well as the Extraordinary Service Award from the National Conference of the Regional People of Scholarship Conferences, and in 2010, the SALT Great Teacher Award. So another impressive bio. And finally, our commentator, Margaret Montoya, also brings a history of excellence to our conversation. She was actually among the first cohort of students of color at Harvard Law School. And she was a member of the University of New Mexico Law School faculty for 28 years after she had practiced law in Massachusetts, New York, and New Mexico. She's also a founding member of LatCrit. And she has combined her work in critical legal theory with the all-important issues of health equity. And she and reproductive health colleagues founded the Centering Equity, Race, and Cultural Literacy and Family Planning Center, which is a collective that really focuses on these issues with a different lens. She's also been active in local political issues involving early childhood education, and during the pandemic, COVID vaccine equity, and she served on the Governor's Advisory Council for Racial Justice. She has been a tremendous mentor to numerous students and junior faculty in both law and medicine, and she has a lot of eponymous things named after her. So she's been recognized with symposia, an annual writing retreat, and numerous academic and community awards. So I think we're in for a treat, and Professor Montoya is going to get us started.
Buenas tardes y buen provecho for those of you grabbing lunch. Qué placer estar aquí con ustedes. Thank you, Rachel, for that lovely introduction for all three of us. And thank you to UCI and ABF for sponsoring this series. I'm going to do a short forward and afterward in keeping with LatCrit practice. And then Frank and Steve will describe what's in the book and how it reimagines the Latinx experience. This book is what my Indigenous law professor, Christine Zuni Cruz, calls a journey narrative. It's a journey across time, across identities and difference, issues and space. Latino law professors first met as a group in 1995 in Puerto Rico. The following year, we met as LatCrit in San Diego. And here is the mug from that meeting. And this year, 28 years later, LatCrit will convene its biennial conference with the theme Hemispheric Justice. From the beginning, LatCrit has explored the question, who is a LatCrit? This question reminds me, and perhaps others of you, of our friend Jerome Culp, and may he rest in peace. Jerome, a gay, Black African-American, used stories and analysis to explain that he too was a LatCrit, and loud and proud. Examining identity and difference as those concepts apply to outsider communities and to the dominant white majority has been a key conversation within LatCrit. From the earliest days, LatCrit has been a big tent, a queer space, a multilingual, mixed status, intergenerational location, including scholars, students, community activists, and the crit curious. LatCrit identities are diverse and contingent, and labels have changed as our understanding has evolved. This is the work implicit in the word Latinx. LatCrit expanded CRT's foundation with our focus on immigration and citizenship, on language and accent as aspects of English hegemony, on religion and Catholic colonization, on what Laura Gomez has called idealized mestizaje, a hybrid coloniality identity that often minimized the indigenous and glorified the Spanish ancestry, while ignoring the genocide and the seizure of knowledge, land, and labor. These issues connect us and are now being examined throughout America Latina. Instead of facing east towards Europe, as most of the US Academy does, LatCrit faces towards Mexico, Central and South America. This is a brief overview of LatCrit's journey across time and identities, difference, issues, and space. I was a bystander to the writing of this book, corresponding with Frank, who was being treated for cancer and experiencing the ravaging side effects of radiation and chemotherapy. Here, I salute his courage. and salute the joint resilience and productivity of both of them during the COVID lockdown. So Frank and Steve, tell us, how does this book cover the journey across these multiple landscapes?
So thank you, Margaret, and many thanks, Rachel and UCI, for the opportunity to talk about the book. And since it's about LatCrit, which we named in the incorporation of LatCrit as Latina and Latino critical legal theory, this is an opportunity to really talk about what we variously called, and through evolution have called over the decades, the 28 years that Margaret mentioned, and the three of us have been there since the inception. We've called it a number of things. Rachel called it a program or an institution. We've also called it an experiment, a collective, a movement, academic activism, and then more recently, informed by the framing of the critical justice textbook that grew out of LatCrit, we've called it an advocacy project. We've recognized it as an advocacy project. And toward what? Toward material progress for Latinx and other outsider groups. And we measure that material progress by actual societal outcomes, not the systemic promises of formal legal equality. And so what do we mean by advocacy projects and LatCrit framed as an advocacy project? We're talking about collaborations and collectives that are strategically deploying critical, legal, and bottom-up knowledge to target the root causes of persistent, frequently collectivized social problems, systemic problems. As we described it, rather than just removing rocks and ameliorating the damage of a rock slide, and I'm not minimizing the importance of that, we've also been looking up to uncover the systemic causes of the slide and trying to ensure that our advocacy work is connected to that more transformative aim of stopping future damage. So why LatCrit, and why did LatCrit emerge when it did as an advocacy project? So the book, which we also call a primer, details the LatCrit origin story and tells it correctly. And the origin story is a genre of LatCrit is a genre of critical outsider jurisprudence that was inspired and informed by critical race theory and also feminist legal theory, and emerged at the same time in the academy as queer theory. LatCrit is a collective that's within and outside at the same time the legal academy that is relying on shared values to negotiate. Over time, a collective means to achieve and support all of those working toward true material equality by, among other things, supplying the theory for that struggle. So why write a book? We meant to tell both the story of the LatCrit history and its values and its methods, as well as to chart future directions for those who participated in the beginning, like the three of us, those who joined, and Rachel as well, and those who joined along the way, or those who may want to join us in the future. But we also did it to supply a model and a living example to help anyone to better organize themselves and others for collective action, particularly within the academy. So with that aim, a law review detailing all of this, it wouldn't have had the same reach as a book would to other disciplines and to those entirely outside the academy, because in turn, LatCrit was informed by insights and knowledge from other disciplines and from activist and community perspectives. And so it's a mutual symbiotic relationship. So what did we learn looking back as part of the reflection in this book? Well, we learned what Bilong Hing wrote about an activist, James Yen, in Asia and elsewhere. We learned a key lesson for activism, which is you start with what you know and you build on what you have. For us, that was the legal academy. So we offer LatCrit as a model through lived experience and experiment of academic activism for other collectives. And LatCrit has embraced that activism despite reluctance and really outright disdain within the academy. for academic activism, especially if it tries to change the academy and the practices within the academy, as LatCrit has tried to do by, among other things, diversifying hiring and diversifying curriculum, and most important, really contesting the delivery, the presentation of law as something other than a savior, and instead as something complicit in unequal societal outcomes, and itself a system in allied conduct with other systems. So the critical schools difference really is that while we simultaneously critique and expose the role and the rule of law, at the same time we acknowledge that law can be important for progress. That's the tension that in the critical justice book we called the critical challenge for legal change agents. And as we suggest in the LatCrit primer book, the Academy imagines scholarship as purely intellectual, as disconnected from politics, and as mostly a solitary or individual project. And in and through LatCrit, we have always embraced the contrary, with theory and praxis connected to community building as a community advocacy project. So our activism has been informed from the near start by common values that are articulated in the book. And those common values really begin with the common anchor of the anti-subordination principle. They don't, at the same time, they don't dictate the means by which we pursue the shared goals of anti-subordination outcomes. Rather, those means to the post-subordination future are the subject of an ongoing cycle of active debate and contestation and conflict resolution within the LatCrit movement or experiment. But those shared values really do provide a shared framework that has ensured that our processes to resolve disputes and to gain knowledge and to distribute that knowledge are going to be democratic rather than imperial, and the product of community and coalition informed by bottom-up knowledge and interdisciplinary and global South perspectives. So what has LatCrit done within the Academy? We can report diversity successes, particularly through the Junior Faculty Development Workshop, but also through supporting the tenure and promotion of a wide swath of community members, including me, through scholarly publication opportunities documented in the book. Also, individual community members obtain individual institutional rewards while contributing to develop a rich and collective record of Latinx critical scholarships that is in turn connected to global advocacy efforts and struggle. We also developed and curated material resources to ensure our own sustainability, and we institutionalized through nonprofit incorporation, an active board that I've participated in for it seems like decades now, actually more than 2 decades, fundraising and other things for stability and sustainability. So why aren't these diversity successes enough? It's because co-optation and other influences mean diversity alone isn't transformative. For example, there's still, as Frank has documented recently, a lack of law school curriculum around Latinx issues and around insights gained from the critical schools of legal knowledge. And despite all these efforts, we still face an overall lack of diversity in Latinx faculty, which is 5% or so compared to 6% of the populace, and academic leadership with maybe 10 Latinx deans out of 200, also around 5%, despite the efforts of LatCrit and others. So along the way, we learned what's needed for institutional change, which is the same ingredients as law and societal change. That's amelioration of immediate harm, sort of removing rocks at the bottom of the slide, to follow that metaphor, while organizing for power and shifting culture within the group and society. So we have evaluated as part of the book, and we invite others to evaluate and critique LatCrit as an advocacy project against those standards, those sort of what we've called 3-layer goals, and all of those have informed our choices and our methods. The book talks about some of the shortcomings of LatCrit, some of the challenges we faced, including multilingualism within our group and our audience. And we're working on that by translating this primer into the Spanish language, along with key parts of our website. Finally, we are addressing that. Also, scholarly continuity and contextual awareness to really ensure that those who are producing LatCrit scholarship and working on its various conferences and advocacy are conversant with its history and the work that came before. And we talk about in the book the scholarship research toolkit that Frank and I developed to convey and be a resource, like a library of sort of where LatCrit has been and the contributions along theme and keyword lines. And we're also, we've also had a number of efforts to organize law students as a resource, and some have been successful, like our Student Scholar program that has elevated a number of people to the Academy, and the new Curso Crítico that is focusing on Global South students. But others, like the Critical Global Classroom, are in limbo that await innovation, such as hybridity, to make them more financially and travel feasible. But at the same time, both the Critical Justice book and the primer, which I'll end with in a second, are tremendous resources for classroom efforts to educate and to organize law students. So why the timing of the book in this moment? It emerged, as Margaret said, from the pandemic. While we were finalizing the Critical Justice textbook, we were spurred by the 25th anniversary of LatCrit, and it prompted a time of reflection in terms of where we'd been and where LatCrit might go in a toxic climate that Margaret describes in her foreword to the book of a global pandemic, and also a pandemic or possibly a normalized endemic of police violence toward Black and Brown and other marginalized communities. So what's next for LatCrit and what could be next? Hybridity that's honed during the pandemic to expand participation. Our next biennial conference is this fall, October, in Cornell, but we're actively debating and considering, given outlandish costs of hotels and facilities and travel, about whether to switch to an entirely virtual platform for that conference. And at minimum, we'll feature a virtual plenary track for those unable to attend in person. We're also focused in the coming years and months and days on ensuring the adoption and the sustainability of that critical justice text that's talked about in this book and is its own separate, much more heavy book. And this is in an environment where teaching that's sourced in the critical schools of legal knowledge is being questioned and even outlawed by critics and the uninformed general public. So please reach out to us if you're interested in adopting any of these resources in the classroom. We also have a Florida physical campus, if you will, the Camposano, and we need to explore the possibilities of Camposano as a critical physical haven in a state, Florida, that's otherwise hostile, sort of the epitome of hostility to critical knowledge. And then finally, which Margaret will talk about more in her afterward, the Critical Legal Collective and LatCrit's role in that, both in its origin and its development of an allied group of scholars drawn from the various schools of critical legal knowledge, of which LatCrit is an integral part. So finally, I think an additional value of this book is as a teaching resource. It's student teaching potential. It's already being used in a couple of law classes. We include general discussion questions that Margaret and I have touched on, which include questions like, what are some of the pressures, incentives, and interests at play in stifling progressive academic activism? What is LatCrit's model or strategy or blueprint to blunt or overcome those interests and those pressures? What are some of the key scholarly contributions of LatCrit, and how do they or how can they connect to action or practice toward an anti-subordination future? A couple more. What are the metrics by which you as a reader or LatCrit as an organization might use to judge the success of LatCrit's academic activism? And should law professors engage in academic activism? Is all legal or other scholarship in some way political? And as Margaret answers, what we've constantly addressed, which is as LatCrit aims to develop a critical activist and interdisciplinary discourse in law and society affecting those who are Latinx who are being ignored for the most part in prior discourse, should LatCrit have taken steps to limit membership and participation to those who are somehow Latinx? And of course, we've answered that we've answered that in light, as Margaret mentioned in her earlier remarks, informed by Jerome Culp and his insights. And then finally, how can theory contribute to local and global struggles against subordination? So I'm going to segue to the godfather of LatCrit, and then you'll hear back from the godmother of LatCrit.
Well, thank you, Steve. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel, this discussion. I want to begin by thanking Rachel and Elizabeth, as well as Steve and Margaret, and really the entire UCI community for inviting us into your space and spending some time with us. We hope that this time will be not only elucidating, but also fun. You know, it really is true that we started with what we knew and we built on what we had. And that really meant responding to the long-term invisibility of Latinas and Latinos in American law and society, in a time of cultural warfare, which since then has only accelerated and evolved, and informed, guided, launched by the insights of critical legal knowledge studies, in particular outsider varieties like critical race theory, which from the beginning we have called LatCrit's cousin, as well as feminist and queer approaches to knowledge and knowledge production. And so from the very, very beginning, building on what we knew, building on what we had, we engaged what was there in plain sight, though hidden, and that is the heterogeneity of Latinas and Latinos. What does it mean? What did it mean? And here I use Latinas and Latinos, even though I know the terminology has gone beyond those terms, just to use the terms that we began with. This spirit of proactive engagement, sustained self-critical engagement, of positionality based on social identity was captured, to mention him also, Jerome Culp, at the outset of this experiment in this quote: "How do we deal with each other? How do we as African Americans, we as white Americans, we as Asian Americans, we as Latino Americans participate in struggles?" And here's the key term, I think, that involve people who are not us, but who could be us and might be us. And so LatCrit, as a systemic advocacy project, that is, as a group of people who have organized actively over time to accomplish stated goals, LatCrit can teach other groups, other Latinas and Latinos, how to view difference and its complexities as an asset, not as a hurdle or as an obstacle, and even when a source of tension, a source of productive tensions, to quote Angela Harris many moons ago. The role of difference in the development of knowledge has been embedded in our conception of what we thought we knew and what we therefore should do in the four functions, even though not explicitly really spelled out, but embedded in the four functions of theory that we hypothesized for ourselves: the production of knowledge, the advancement of social justice, the expansion and interconnection of, quote, different struggles, and the cultivation of critical communities and coalitions. Clearly, none of those are possible without a conscious, programmatic, persistent, and self-critical engagement of multiple sources of difference, not only those based on social identity. In the LatCrit example, this engagement required, first and foremost, confronting what we might call the essential Latina or Latino, the Hispanic, Catholic, heteronormative, innate, heteronuclear family stereotype, and the identities that privilege and make that stereotype pervasive. Hispanismo, an ideology that is promoted by Spain, as well as by Spain-identified Latino elites throughout the entire globe, but especially in our instance in the US and other parts of this hemisphere. And so, in other words, how do we center to learn from Black Latinas and Latinos, gay Latinas and Latinos, and even non-Latinas and Latinos when conventionally defined, such as indigenous people or Asian people, though Filipinos, how you categorize them remains a question that we return to from time to time. And in the end, it matters only because social identities have been made pivots of power, pivots of empowerment, and pivots of disempowerment. And it is understanding how those different identities work as those different pivots, but in an interconnected way, that we might hope to make the kind of enduring progress, three-layered progress, transformative progress that Steve mentioned earlier. And so in LatCrit, we implemented this programmatic centering and therefore decentering through what we call and describe in the book as rotations of the center, implemented through streams of programming over a course of years and conferences. So we would focus, for instance, on a topic, perhaps in a plenary session, and then follow up subsequent years with concurrent panels or workshops or other types of events that would ensure that no engagement was just a one-shot engagement, but rather a progression communally in the development of knowledge in the service of those four functions, so that we could be on the same page. Substantively, we began with ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, and continued and branched out to indigeneity, class, religion, culture. And we also self-consciously sought to bridge those divides that many had lamented for so long, even back then, the divides between the local and the global, or the domestic and the international, between theory and action, or between what we do in the academy and what is done in practice, and then the divide between law and every other discipline in the planet. And these too are sources of difference that we sought to engage programmatically and proactively. Differences that took us across place, time, culture, region, academic disciplines, as well as the kinds of scholarship that we needed to become literate in. And so it's a process of learning as well as the process of growth, personally, communally, and intellectually. This substantive and programmatic engagement through rotations and streams is visible very much so in the themes and keywords that are online in the toolkit, research toolkit that Steve already mentioned, and are also very notable in the appendices at the end of the book that give you the titles of the conference themes and the accompanying publications. And if you look at only the first 10, you will see how they take you through the very themes and topics such as difference, solidarity, and law, building Latino communities through LatCrit theory, followed next year by comparative Latinas and Latinos, identity, law, and policy in LatCrit theory, followed by rotating centers, expanding frontiers, LatCrit theory and marginal intersections, followed by class in LatCrit theory and praxis in a world of economic inequality, and just to make the point, followed by Latinas and the Latinos, and the Americas, centering South-North frameworks in LatCrit theory. And that is followed by coalitional theory and strategies of resistance, countering culture conf politics, and a return to economic injustice for the 10th annual conference. So that's just a short little journey through the first 10 years of LatCrit conferences and how we centered different aspects of Latino heterogeneity in order to build anti-subordination solidarity based on difference, that is, using difference as an asset. And so it's important to begin concluding that in LatCrit, this engagement of difference is not some sort of free-floating particularization of everyone and everything, but rather an anchoring of the process of learning with the values and principles of anti-subordination in order to not get caught up in what used to be called in the 1990s, the sameness difference dilemma, which was, well, if none of us are the same and if we're all different, then none of us are really, well, we don't exist. We as a we, there is no we, there is you and you and you, but who is the we if all of us are different on some ultimate level of particularity? Well, we avoid that kind of free-floating particularity, that sort of nosedive into navel-gazing, by reminding ourselves constantly that our purpose is rooted in anti-subordination progress, and that is why we engage in the interrogation and embrace of difference, and for no other reason. And so therefore, we understand that bottoms do shift, as Athena Montoya put it many years ago, depending on the context or depending on shifting circumstances in the context. This sustained proactive engagement of difference as an anti-subordination asset can and should inform the reimagining of Latino activism across all 4 areas of advocacy highlighted in this talk series: immigration, education, the economy, and politics. If we pause to think about it, for each and all of those, critical coalitions made up of multiply diverse groups and persons are literally indispensable, including, to end where we began, with what we might call Latino communities and coalitions that go beyond Hispanismo and that span the race, gender, class, religion, sexuality, and other axes of similarity and of difference that make up those people whom we call Latinas and Latinos. All of this work has led most recently to the creation of a new network, a new formation, the Critical Legal Collective, that Margaret will speak more about. But that illustrates also the importance of difference, because of engaging difference and managing difference and building on difference and using difference as an asset, because it is a very intentional, deliberate, strategic linking of pre-existing formations that already embrace and manage multiple kinds of difference. And through that greater interconnection, we hope to be able to make a greater social justice impact, both in the academy and in society. Thank you very much.
Let me now suggest that we use some of the presentation tools that we've developed in reproductive justice. So one of the things that we do is a time check. But the other thing that we do is we call a caucus of the presenters to see if we need to make some adjustments. And I would suggest that we take some questions now, and then depending on the time that we have, I can come back for the afterward. But I think it's really important that we engage. I think that there's so much out there right now from what both of you have said about the book, that I think if you agree, I think that we should take some questions.
And we do have some questions, and if you want to add your own question, please use the question and answer function. Elizabeth, did you want to go ahead and pose the questions we already have?
Yeah, and one attendee sent multiple questions, so I'll just read them all together as they're related. I would like to ask if LatCrit ever tackled the question of whether Latina, Latino, Latinx as a group in the US should be a race or ethnicity. What have been the consequences of being racialized as, quote, other without having an actual box in all the forms that use race to categorize people in the United States, including the census? And then relatedly, I have an additional question based on what Professor Valdes said about Latinos, Latinas being a heterogeneous group. Could the same be said about the African-American / Black, Asian, Native American, and white groups? Yet they are included under a group race identity to fit the way they have been racialized in the United States. So why should Latinos not accept the group racialization within a race category as those other groups?
I can make a brief remark first to say that we've begun to have this conversation on a Latinx law professor discussion email discussion list, and it really starts and connects to what Frank said. You know, everything around the racialization, race versus ethnicity. That's all a social construct. It's designed to subordinate. And what LatCrit and others have tried to do is, how can we use identity as an asset? How can we take ownership of what has been imposed from above toward ends that are subordinating rather than anti-subordination progress?
Well, I guess what I would say very, very briefly is that, yes, we've tackled that question. That was at the very beginning, very much what we tackled, and the first 2 or 3 symposia are full of essays tackling that question. And yes, of course, the same can be said about every group on Earth. Every group of people is heterogeneous. That's, I think, the insight of intersectionality, or however you want to phrase it. We all embody multiple combinations of social identities. And so, of course, every group is heterogeneous. And so therefore, what matters is how is that relevant to the social context, the legal context, the moment, the project, the task of justice. And so in the US, as I said, we began in the context of cultural warfare, the emergence of CRT and other critical schools of legal thought, but also as a result of generations of border shifts and conquests and internal colonies and migration patterns and foreign and imperialism and foreign entanglements that produce new immigrant communities in the US in subsequent years after the debacle becomes clear. And so all of that informs, for instance, the relevance of heterogeneity in the US for critical race theory in the 1990s, and the histories of the Latina and Latina diasporas would inform how a LatCrit project might approach or might assess the relevance of heterogeneity in that context, in that after that historical process and in that historical moment for the US, in the US for Latinas and Latinos at that point in time. So again, the answers in the abstract are yes. What matters is the context and the particularity, but grounded in anti-subordination, purpose, and solidarity.
Let me make a couple observations. One, I think that we need to remember the way that the casta system worked in the 16th and 17th century in the New World, that the Spaniards, because they were a limited number, were challenged by their own caste system, because what they needed to do is they needed to create new Spaniards for their governing and ruling process. And so they created a rule quite unlike the one-drop rule that operated under slavery in the United States. They created a rule where castiza, who was the child of mestiza, which was the child of someone of an indigenous Spanish pairing, that the castiza mated with a Spaniard became a Spaniard. And so we have to remember that this purpose is for white supremacy. It is for subordination. It was true under the Spaniards, and it's true under the census. The first purpose of the census is to distribute hundreds of millions of dollars to communities. If in fact they can confuse communities about what category they belong to, they can minimize the amount of money going to people of color. And that certainly has happened with the Latino community, because the Latino community is both driven by its own internal white superiority complex, where some people, in fact, do want to be thought of as white and Spanish. And so they are eager to check that box, where other people just don't. And my family does not fit in any of those boxes. We are always in the other category, with me writing mestiza or some other word across these documents. But we have to remember that it suits white supremacy, the dominant majority, for a certain group. And now it isn't only Latinos or Latinxes, but Asian people who now are in this liminal category, and some are choosing to move into the white category to maintain a white dominant majority. And so we need to think about this. But let me switch over to the way that medicine has dealt with culture and ethnicity, because it has been the way to maintain color blindness in medical research. Because instead of talking about race and racism, there has been an emphasis on culture. And so they talk about cultural competence, for example. The literature is replete with race doing the work, with culture doing the work of race. And it is only very recently that people are beginning to really emphasize the fact that there is a gap in medical education, and that it can only be filled with critical knowledge, that you need to bring in critical race theory, LatCrit, and other theories in order to address the racial inequities and in order to improve health outcomes. I could go into greater detail, but just to make one point, so that today, instead of talking about cultural competence, the more precise term is structural competence, because in fact, it addresses not only interpersonal racism, but structural, institutional, systemic racism.
I think that's a really important insight. I just learned that from Margaret recently and from the medical literature. And it really takes one's thinking to the next level in terms of systemic advocacy and the kinds of things that Steve was talking about also.
Elizabeth, did you want to pose any of the other questions that have come in?
yeah, sorry, they were not popping up on my screen. Okay, so some follow-up questions to some of the comments just shared. Follow-up to Professor Bender. This is from Emerita Reyes. I began that discussion in the Latinx Law Professors group, but to date, no one else has contributed to the discussion. Wondering if you're going to participate in that discussion, as it seems to me that there has been a reluctance of Latino, Latinx law professors to tackle the question head on even now. And then in response to Professor Montoya's point, could it be that some Latinos, Latinas, Latinxes are choosing white because there has been no Latinx box? Gathering data of Latinx with a mixed race ancestry will help us collect better data.
I'd like to hear from Margaret, so I'll be real brief and hear her remarks in closing as well. But I appreciate Marita's initiation of that and other topics. And I continually, when I do the census, don't see me there. But I'm the son of a single Mexican mother, and born in East LA and Boyle Heights. And I appreciate this discussion, but I also think Margaret's remarks around the context are really important, sort of context and history, and realizing where things are coming from, and us individually and collectively making decisions on how to participate in those framings, and also remembering what Frank said about from below using identity as an asset rather than trying to fit into a box that's imposed from above, and often to sort of further purposes that are power-based and power maintenance. So Margaret, if we can hear from you in our last 5 minutes, that would be great, because I don't see any other open questions.
So let me go to my afterword. So at the heart of LatCrit, like critical race theory, is this question about how law and policy can be used to facilitate opportunity and upward mobility for under-resourced and subordinated communities. So let me quickly sketch some of the problems. I'm just going to just gloss over them, facing the communities in the Latinx communities in immigration, education, the economy, and in politics. And then let me propose some near-term policy responses. That is, in reimagining, I think that we could do a long lens, but let me use a shorter lens. So the pandemic revealed the desperate situation of essential workers, right? And we can talk about doctors and firefighters, but many of the most exploited workers were Latinx in low-income positions. They became sick and died in disproportionate numbers. But the pandemic showed us the power of policy, because it can alleviate poverty and suffering in very quick ways. There were 3 rounds of stimulus checks, plus unemployment benefits, child tax credits, food and childcare payments. $1.8 trillion went out to individuals and families, and another $1.7 trillion went to businesses in COVID relief. The economy rebounded, but now we find that there aren't enough workers. And so rather than open the border, if you will, the people who are presenting themselves are too brown, too black, too other. So consider this: in the 1960s, Latinos were 3.3% of the population, 5.8 million. Today, we are 60 million, or almost 19% of the total population. The fear is that immigrants coming will replace white people. This fear fuels conspiracies and stochastic gun violence. Dreamers are the group that have been the worthiest of those who lack status, but Congress has refused to act. But this isn't inevitable. We've seen young people in the streets protesting violence, protesting the status, and I think that their coalitions will transform the policy landscape. Let me speak a moment about the Dobbs case, because it has created barriers even for rich white women. But the most burdened are the undocumented, the abused, non-English speaking women and girls. But there are also trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people who need abortions. At last year's Harvard CRT conference, we learned about a 9-year-old Haitian girl from a devout Catholic family, pregnant from incest, undocumented, and in detention at the Texas border. How does a child like that navigate the labyrinths to get health care? How does that child survive? Higher education has been an escalator, a social escalator for entire families, and mine certainly is in that category. Some of us, and I would say all of mine in my generation, went to law school or medical school through affirmative action. But the rogue Supreme Court is likely to overrule the cases and get rid of it. And so we need to think of race-neutral alternatives. So one of the things that I propose is there a way to use social justice and civic engagement backgrounds as criteria for admission? We already heard of other ideas. Consider this: Latinxes are fewer than 6% of all lawyers, and Latinx students in 2020 were only 7% of the entering class. We need to fully fund public education and early childhood education. New Mexico is using its massive land grant permanent fund, valued at $26 billion, to guarantee early childhood education from prenatal to age 5. 75% of those children are children of color. It's a massive redistribution program. But there are other headwinds for education: the DeSantis-led book bans and the attacks on CRT. These are attacks on progressive faculty and teachers, on the First Amendment, on academic freedom, on critical pedagogies, and on tenure. Frank and I, we've already talked about the Critical Legal Collective. We have a subgroup of students and recent grads. If you're interested, please contact me. We are trying to involve students in this progress. We are trying to use our academic skills to unpack, resist, and counter these attacks to critical knowledge. The economy is the most unequal it's ever been. The lowest 50% now own 3.3% of the nation's wealth. And you know what? Slavery and racism are the chief reasons. This is acknowledged by virtually all economists now. Industries have reported record-breaking profits, but Latinx families and other low-income families are struggling. Wage theft is ubiquitous. Housing is scarce. Inner city and rural communities are designated as food deserts. They don't have banks. They don't have hospitals. And how did we get here? Through policy, through laws, through the privatization and monopolization of public goods. Neoliberalism is to blame. But there's good news. Workers are organizing. Unions are resurging, even among professionals, doctors, nurses, and even LatCrit professors. Some jurisdictions are experimenting with guaranteed income, providing baby bonds for each newborn. These are ideas that were sneered at not long ago, and they're now finding legislative support. The widespread voter suppression, gerrymandering, hidden campaign contributions, followed by election denials, have created a new political reality. And this is aided and abetted by right-wing media with no allegiance to the truth. Reviving the fairness doctrine will begin balancing reporting. But young people have proven adept at thwarting these attempts to subvert democracy. We can look at AOC and Maxwell Frost and other activists who are now in Congress. They are using law and policy to resist the dangers of the Republican Party, which unfortunately, as a party, has decided to abandon democracy and the Constitution. Let's recall that 9-year-old Haitian girl. A tenet of critical theory is the practice of looking to the bottom. Steve mentioned it, Frank mentioned it. A starting point can be with this child that has almost no socio-legal grounding. The critical justice book tells us that eschewing top-down analyses and looking instead to the bottom helps advocates to dissect, to deconstruct root causes of persistent collectivized inequities. That's the task for law and policy for a reimagined Latinx future. It's been our privilege to be here with you today. Mil gracias.
Yes, and let me echo those thanks to Professor Bender, Professor Valdes, and Professor Montoya for this very stimulating book talk. And I also wanted to mention, we actually had 3 Clyde Ferguson Award winners, and Professor Montoya was too modest to put it in her bio, so we really had the trifecta. I also wanted to let you know that the next book talk will be on Wednesday, March 1st at 12 noon Pacific. We'll be focusing on a book called Empowered, Empoderados, which is about the rise of Latinos in Arizona politics and the way that they transformed immigration policy in the state and some of the practices of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. So I hope you will join us then. And thank you to all of you for being a part of today's discussion.